Let's start with your name.
You want the whole thing?
Mm-hmm.
Carl Michael Julien. I don't go with my first name, I just go by Mike.
Okay.
So, that's the way I was raised.
What year were you born?
1951.
How long have you lived in North Baltimore?
All my life. I was in the Navy for a while, but I still count that as living here because this was what was called the home of record. So while you're in the service, you're moving around a lot, but all of your permanent information goes back to your home. So always North Baltimore.
And what keeps you in North Baltimore?
It's home. I mean, it's there's nothing really that I've found in my travels, and I've been around a little bit in the military, that isn't better here. Life is more comfortable here. It's less demanding, a lot less stress, and we can get anything we need within a short distance. So there's no reason really to live anywhere else. And my job has always been fortunate to the point where I've found work close enough that I could stay here.
Good. So you went to school in North Baltimore?
Yes.
And what was that like?
Well, I skipped kindergarten only because I lived next door to my first grade teacher, and she convinced my mom and dad that I didn't need it. And it was optional back in those days. You didn't have to go. So I started out in the first grade down at the old school. And at that point in time, all K through 12 was down there at that address, although the kindergarten was in a house that was outside the actual main building. But all the rest of the grades were housed in that building, and I was there just for first grade. And then the Powell School opened in 1958, which is the beginning of my second grade year. So.
What kind of trends were popular in your youth?
For younger adults and everything else, cars were a big thing. In the 1950s, that's when the faster cars came around. So about in the mid-50s, when they introduced like the Corvette and the Thunderbird and the Chevy Bel Airs and all that stuff, people were interested in faster and faster cars that had more and more horsepower. And they changed the styles of the cars every year back then. So you could easily distinguish between like a 58 or a 59 or a 62 model from any year either way, because they were styled slightly different. So it was, for me growing up and all my friends, we were fascinated with that kind of stuff. And the other thing that I really liked a lot was swimming. So there used to be the stone quarry that still is out on the north side of town, and it was called the Wixom Sports Club back then. And you could buy a family membership for like $10 or something like that. So for me, throughout the summer, any chance I had, I would go to the quarry to swim. That was kind of my passion. So that's kind of the different things. I don't know that life was pretty much a lot simpler then. There was not a lot of distractions as far as technology or anything other than what was coming out in cars. And so people were just living daily life. Kids played together, played ball, or for me, and swimming.
What kind of stories were you told as a child?
I was fortunate that my two grandfathers were just loaded with all kinds of interesting stories. So some of them were about their childhood, other things were about just different people that we knew throughout town and everything like that. And at that point in time, family was much more important. Family units were more integral. So the stories that I would hear a lot of times were when we would go visit relatives and stuff like that. And I would talk with my cousins. I had plenty of cousins. And so we would share the stories of the different things, adventures we were on. I was involved in scouting, and so for a lot of my stories were associated with things that we did at camp or things we were planning to do. So predominantly it was just more about routine daily life and the things that were happening at that point in time. There were a few major events that people would talk about, but mostly just enjoying life.
And what was your experience with scouting?
I had a great experience. I started out as a Cub Scout, and there used to be 2 Cub Scout packs in North Baltimore. And so I started out, I think it was pack 305, which if I remember, Dr. Roberts, Bill Roberts, was the Cub Master at that point in time. But it didn't last very long, and I think that I migrated over to pack 372, which is still going. But after Cub Scouts, I was in a Cub Scouts when we had the 50th anniversary for Scouting in 1960. And then I went into Boy Scouts, and then that was just like Scouting ideals achieved. Everything that you would kind of expect and think about in Scouting was common at that point in time. So we had the same thing with camps that we do today. I went to a lot of extra camps. I was fortunate that when I was 15, I was able to save up enough money to go to Philmont out in New Mexico. And I think I may have been the first kid from North Baltimore to do that.
That's
And that year, I was the only one. We didn't have a group from North Baltimore, so I went with a bunch of kids I didn't know that were all from the Toledo area. But we got along great, and it was an amazing adventure, unlike anything you could achieve. But that was kind of the crown jewel of Scouting as a whole, that and, getting ranks and Adult Day.
Yeah.
That was to me the highlight. So.
What are some of your occupations?
When I was a younger boy, I started out as a paper boy, and at that point in time, kids in my day and age were very anxious to find work. And so I was lucky enough to get a job when I was 15, which is the earliest you were allowed to get a work permit. And I got a job at the grocery store up here, and in fact, Larry Slaughterback, who's a member of the Historical Society here, was my boss. So he kind of mentored me and taught me a lot of things, and there were others from here in town. Phyllis Mercer's husband, actually Phyllis and her husband Carl owned the store, so they were very influential in my early childhood labor history, if you want to think of my career development. Then I went to work my senior year, I think, or the summer before, at the hardware store here in town. And that was Davis Hardware, which is now gone. But from that point, I got out of high school, and I was fortunate that the next day after I graduated, I started to work for the B&O Railroad. And worked there until I went into the Navy. And I enlisted as soon as I could, but you had to wait until you were 18 before you could actually go. So I enlisted when I was 17, but then I had to hang around for a while. So as soon as I turned 18, then I went in the Navy, and I was in the Navy for 8 years, and then I got out and went into the telephone industry because it was related to communications that I had learned in the military, and stayed there throughout my whole career.
Okay. And how's your experience with the Navy?
Oh, it was fantastic. I really did enjoy the Navy. There were times, of course, anybody in the military at some point in time thinks, why did I do this? But all in all, I did really enjoy it. I got to see a lot of great places. The weird part for me is, as a sailor, almost everybody gets a chance to serve on the ship. I did not. There was an incident before I went in that the North Koreans captured one of our ships. And it was essentially, I don't want to say a spy ship, but they were gathering intelligence. And that was the career field that I was in. I worked in the intelligence group. And after that, we weren't allowed to be on a ship for a while. And so for the majority of my career, it was all land-based. So it was somewhat different, but I was fortunate. I was in Pearl Harbor for a good majority of my Navy career, and was lucky enough to be selected to serve on the staff of the admiral that was in charge of the entire Navy throughout the Pacific. So he was a 4-star admiral, and we had a whole bunch of admirals in our building. And it was beautiful because we were in Pearl Harbor. I was there 3 years, and could look out on our balcony and look down and see the Arizona Memorial. It was very pretty. So I was very fortunate in that. And then after that, I had a lot of schooling. The Navy sent me through about 80 weeks of schooling. And in the Navy school, you're there 8 hours a day, 5 days a week. So a lot of classroom time. Also served in San Francisco, Pensacola, Florida, Chesapeake, Virginia, and Keflavik, Iceland. So it was kind of interesting. I don't regret one day of it.
What are some major historical events that you've lived through?
Well, of course, Neil Armstrong landing on the moon was 1969, and that was my senior year. So that was something that was very strong in my memory. Of course, John Kennedy, when he was assassinated, I think I was in the 7th grade or something like that at that point in time. And everyone remembers where they were when they heard that news and went through those issues in history. But there were so many other things that developed. The whole Vietnam War. I had a different perspective a little bit because working in an intelligence center, we saw a lot of the raw data that was coming in, and you got a kind of a different idea and mindset as to what was going on over there. So that was a little bit of an interesting thing as far as events. One other thing that I would say that, I don't know if it's a historical thing, but just the development in technology that I've seen over my years is just phenomenal. See things that were new and being released that didn't last that long, but were integral for steps to move technology forward. So there were, even for me in the telephone industry, the advancements that took place. When I first started, we were still working on electromechanical equipment. I worked in what was called a central office, and that's where the switching centers actually are. So when you picked up your phone, that's the machinery that provided dial tone, and when you dialed, which was the old rotary dial back then, that's what all that stuff made the connections electrically. I can't say electronically because they were all mechanical. But that stuff was actually patented back in the 1800s, and it was still in use in the 1980s. So at least 100 years of that technology existed, and then it just took off to the point where everything became electronic and then digital, and to the point now it's really much all internet protocols, and running on networks. It doesn't even run on telephone wires as much anymore. So all those kinds of things, just see the advent of technology as it unfolded is remarkable.
What other inventions came out in your youth?
Well, one of the things that always comes to mind, of course, it was really prior to me, but I do remember when we got our first TV set, people used to listen to the radio. I was very small at that point in time, but I remember our first TV. And then things, transistor radios were big when I was a teenager, because before then, things were still using vacuum tubes. And I don't even know if you know what that is or not why, but it's old technology that existed long ago. And then when it went to transistors, which were developed by actually AT&T, I think was the one that came out with the transistor technology and silicon-based switching. Things kind of accelerated very quickly. One other thing that comes to mind is microwave ovens, because that technology actually developed from radar, from ships and so forth, that they noticed that the power of the radar beams that they were trying to search for planes and everything else, when it was at full power, I mean, you could kill a bird in flight is from the power that was generated. And so they kind of grabbed that technology to heat food. And the first microwave oven that we had, as a matter of fact, was an Amana was the brand name, and it was called Radar Range. So the Amana Radar Range was one of the early models of a microwave. And it uses the same thing. It's a klystron tube that generates the energy that cooks food. So that was one thing, and that's still being used. So that has not evolved out of it. But so many other things, cassette tapes, the old 8-track tapes, what are called magnetic tapes. You don't see magnetic tape hardly at all anymore. Extremely rare, because everything is digital. And everything will eventually move to the point where even DVDs and CDs and all that stuff will all disappear. Everything will go to what I would term as non-rotating memory. And a lot of that comes from video game technology. Atari was the first home video console that, instead of having to program something in or something like that, they'd give you a little module that you would plug into the game deck, and Nintendo did the same thing. And that was the game. But basically all you're doing is you're reading the memory off the chips that are in that little plastic module. And so eventually it will be the same thing like we use USB devices for now. It's all just memory stored on a chip, and we don't need any mechanical thing to spin something to read it off of a disk or off of a hard drive. So.
How has the world grown and changed throughout your life?
There are more countries, I think, now than there were when I was a child. I can't even keep up with the different countries that have come and gone in Africa. There have been others, I think, in Asia. Most all the European countries, I think, are still intact, but particularly one example is when the Soviet Union, which actually started 100 years ago, I think it was 1917 or 18 or something, when the Bolsheviks had their revolution and started the Soviet Union, USSR. Then when it fell apart, I think it was around 1989 or something like that, maybe 90, I'm not sure. Then a lot of those countries came back into existence, because I had never heard of like Kyrgyzstan or even Armenia or Jordan or one of those kinds of things that became countries of their own again, because it was all just part of the Soviet Union. So from that standpoint, the world has grown as far as politically. I think that from a cultural standpoint, we're still exactly the same. People have always been the same. We have the same hang-ups and hardships and frustrations and challenges and joys that we've always had. So while we express them, seems to be different. The underlying goals and everything else are still much the same.
And what do you think the world will be like in 20 years?
That one's kind of a great one. I mean, looking back 20 years and how much it's changed, I actually want to think back to what was maybe even 100 years ago. And I've read different things that I found that were quite interesting about how much things were and what the average things, because if you think about 100 years ago, there weren't even that many automobiles around. Even 100 years from now, they were really starting to take off, but people are still riding around on horses and buggies and stuff like that, and the technology that we have today has pretty much all evolved since the Industrial Revolution, which was about 1900 when it really started to kick off, or late 1800s. So if you think about just the advances that have happened almost from one year to the next, 20 years from now, I'm really hoping that we don't have flying cars the way everybody always predicted. We haven't even mastered driving on the ground yet. I'd hate to think of having some of those morons up in the air. But we're at that advent right now of self-driving cars, which is kind of one of the big developments in our transportation. Overall, I think that in technology advances, it's not always good, because we have, as a people, become more and more dependent upon that technology to do a lot of things for us, especially the way it forms our outlook on life. So if we get self-driving cars and people don't have to do anything, they just sit down and program in where they want to go, and then sit back and treat it like they're in a living room, I don't know that that's going to be particularly advantageous to society. It's going to be great for probably safety, I'm guessing, because I would like to think that the computers are going to have a little bit no road rage type issues, those kinds of things that cause problems. But overall, we become more and more sedentary. And I think that's true just in our culture as a whole. So I don't know that that's particularly a good thing. From a technological standpoint, again, it's going to be awesome. I mean, I think that a lot of the things that 20 years from now we're going to take for granted haven't even been conceived at this point. And particularly in the field of electronics, and it's one of the things that I've always kind of enjoyed, because that's the world that I was from. Everything gets better and yet cheaper. Nothing else that I can think of becomes better and more reliable that doesn't cost more, because you're paying for that dependability and those new features and advances. But in the electronics world, it seems the opposite. A number of years ago, you could go to buy a computer, and you were not going to buy any computer that was worth carrying out of a store for less than a couple $1,000s. Now you can get a halfway decent computer for $300 or $400, and you can buy tablets. They're not really good ones, but you can buy tablets for $50 or $60. It's just amazing from that standpoint. So I'm kind of excited to see what may be coming, but at the same time somewhat apprehensive about what it's going to be doing to us as a society.
And what do you think North Baltimore is going to be like in 20 years?
Well, I would like to think that eventually, as we become more of a metropolitan area throughout the Midwest, technically, that the little towns will eventually be absorbed. I don't know that that's particularly a good thing, but I do anticipate seeing that. We are in a particularly interesting situation, although it hasn't evolved the way we anticipated, with the intermodal terminal that went in at CSX, and that's been 8 years ago now, pretty much. We anticipated substantial growth in our community. There was one community that had an intermodal that went in down in Texas, and they thought that it would bring in 3,000 new jobs, but it actually brought in like about 17,000 new jobs. So we anticipated we're going to have to get our acts together. We're going to have to start planning now for our community. Otherwise, the tail's going to wag the dog, and they're just going to run crazy, and there's not going to be any design or no intelligent planning for this to go forward. Well, I guess it's kind of fortunate in a way, because it hasn't transpired yet. There have not been very many jobs that have resulted in any growth in North Baltimore as a result of the intermodal yard. I still think that it's a huge opportunity for what it could become. But at this point in time, people have become somewhat uncaring about continuing the preparation and planning that we should have been doing all along. Now, we've done some wonderful things in the community. Most of it you don't see because it's in the ground. Fortunately, I think next year we're going to see Main Street get the facelift that we've been waiting on for almost 8 or 9 years now. But that should be just a start. And I don't know that we have the interest in the property owners to continue that. The building owners do have to step up and buy into that concept. There are funds that are available if they choose to commit some of their funding, that there's some aid money that they could use to improve the presentation of their buildings. By and large, you look down the street and there aren't that many modern styled buildings. The downtown area sits empty. A lot of stores are unoccupied, and they're certainly not very attractive in their front facade. They still look like old buildings. So if you think about 100 years ago when the town burned down and all those things were built at that point in time from that fire that happened a long time ago, they still kind of, most of them look the same way. They haven't been maintained well. Some exceptions, certainly, but by and large, not very good. So I don't know that we're going to see a whole lot different. I would like to think so. We haven't grown very slowly in my lifetime, but I mean, I don't think we've grown more than 500 or 600 people in population in the last 60 years. So 20 years from now, it may be the same, or it could turn around and get crazy. So it's kind of up in the air. I think that we have the opportunity, but sometimes I question the willpower to do what's needed to make it happen.
What are your personal hopes for the future?
Well, a good deal of those are based on faith. So my hopes are that that I'll live long enough to see my grandchildren grow up and have families, and that they'll all remain close to God, because I think that's really our future for all of us, whether we want to admit it or not. But someday we're going to be asked what our faith life has been, and so I want that to be positive for everybody, not just my family or anything like that, but particularly because those are the ones that I'm closest to. I want to see that happen. So my personal ambitions and everything else are to do what I can to look for the good in people, to the point where I try to allow them, by finding the good in them, that they'll kind of take that as a cue and look for the good things in other people, so that we focus on those things, and that makes life a whole lot happier.
That'd be great. Is there anything else you wanted to say?
In a small town, and it may be the same way in other larger communities, but it seems the bigger the town, the more impersonable people are. They're not as friendly to their neighbors. In a smaller town, you know your neighbors, and you enjoy life living with them, and seeing the joys of their kids grow up and all those kinds of things. And particularly as I was growing up, children had a pretty much a respect for elders. It didn't matter whether they liked them or not, because there were some mean and crotchety old people too, but you still showed them the respect that came with age. You were taught that. There were a number of people in our community that I think back, and I think how fortunate we were growing up in North Baltimore to have known so many great people that had made their homes here. And there are countless stories of those things. That's the whole reason for the Historical Society. As I look around and see pictures of the people on the walls here, I mean, a number of them I knew. And I think, wow, those were really some awesome people. There are at least a half a dozen that I can think of off the top of my head that helped formulate my ideals and I wanted to be like them. Besides my own parents, of course, but I thought, when I grow up, I want to be able to have that kind of influence on some other child's life, to the point where they know that they're important, and that people are looking out for them, and that there's things that they can do, and the knowledge of those people as they're growing up. When you become an adult, you know whether they're good, bad, or indifferent and everything else, and if they need a little help, you might be able to do that. So I think that's one of the things that I would like to add, that we try to encourage that same mindset to remain a part of our community that's made it what it is. That's it.
Okay.
Well, thanks for having me. I do appreciate it, and I am truly looking forward to when you get done and we go to your board of review, because I think this is one of the nicest projects that I've seen, and I've seen quite a few. So, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay.